just take a minute, because I know everybody hasn't been able to be in all three of our services. This is the third service. And let me take a couple minutes, not long, just to kind of review what we've been doing in the last couple of weeks in case you had to miss something. The first week of our time together, we talked about the importance of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Why is it so important that there be a bodily resurrection? And I gave some statistics. I mean, some of you have talked to me about this, kind of startled, that in mainline Protestant churches, by that they could be Methodist, they could be Episcopalian, they could be liberal Presbyterian, but in mainline Protestant churches, that even only 1/3 of the pastors surveyed believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Now again, I asked myself, why are they even in the ministry? If that's the case, that's another story. But some might say, well, Jesus does not have to raise from the dead to be a godly example for us. Buddha didn't rise from the dead. Muhammad didn't rise from the dead. Why would Jesus have to rise from the dead? And I tried to answer that question the first week in showing that if we're going to trust in Jesus, if we're going to believe what He taught in the Scripture, if He's going to be a godly example, if we're going to live by the precepts, we have to understand He also said He was going to rise from the dead. He said He was the Son of God. And He either was telling the truth on this stuff or He was lying. And like I said, with C.S. Lewis, you don't have the option of just accepting Jesus as a great moral teacher or leader. He didn't leave us that option. He either is the Son of God or He's not. Last week, we walked through the evidence of the resurrection. And the point that I wanted to make in that was that you don't have to just have faith. You have to have faith to believe in Jesus. You have to have faith to be saved. But if you just treat the Bible like you would any other history book, at the same level of credibility as any other history book, and look at Christian literature and pagan literature and Jewish literature, what does it teach us about Jesus? And last week we looked at the evidence, the facts. It's like we were going for a court case. And so the evidence teaches us that Jesus lived in first century Palestine. He was a teacher. He was a miracle worker. He had disciples. He was crucified on the cross. All those things are clear from Scripture and other literature. And the tomb went missing. There's no question about that. Jewish literature, pagan literature, Christian literature all show us these things. Well, what happened to His body? Well, that's the debate. What else do the facts teach us? The facts teach us that Jesus' followers, on many occasions, claimed to have seen Him rise from the dead. They claimed that He was raised from the dead. And we'll talk more about that a little bit. There's no question about that. Those who had been so frightened and so afraid, and they wouldn't even fight for Jesus while He was alive, something happened to make them believe that He was raised from the dead. Even the stories, well, we'll talk about, even the stories themselves would be amazing. But then finally I said, this is obvious, this is fact, this is evidence. Something happened so dramatic to those Jewish believers that they changed 1,400 years of tradition. Now again, I talked about that a little bit last week if you were here. Remember, I mean, we all know how hard it is to change anything in the church today. I mean, if you want to change, you know, the color of the wallpaper or the paint on the walls, you can have a church split over it. If you want to change from 6 to 6:30, you can have a church split. I mean, things get ingrained. That's the way we've always done it. Imagine trying to change 1,400 years of tradition. Stop worshiping on Saturday, start worshiping on Sunday. Stop going to the temple. Stop offering sacrifice. Stop believing that it was circumcision, the keeping of the law, that made you different than the rest of the world. Think about those kind of changes. And what made people who should have known better willing to die for a belief? And I think the only obvious answer, based on the evidence, based on the facts, is that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, however, today, and I realize and you realize, not everybody agrees with this. Not everybody agrees with this idea of Jesus rising from the dead. I want to refer back to someone I mentioned 2 weeks ago, John Dominic Crossan. He was one of the founders, if you're here 2 weeks ago, that Jesus seminar I talked about, who believed that 80% of the stuff in the New Testament Jesus didn't say, and they said we ought to give Jesus a demotion, and we ought to demythologize Jesus, and so on and so forth. Crossan doesn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He said a better explanation is that His body was thrown in a common grave and eaten by wild dogs. He said Mark made up the whole story about the women visiting the tomb. That never happened. The early Christians didn't see Jesus rise from the dead. That was all made up. That was all a fairy tale. They didn't really believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus themselves. Now, this is not surprising, considering He also does not believe in the virgin birth. He said a better explanation than the virgin birth was that Jesus was the bastard child of a Roman soldier. That's his suggestion. Now my question is this. Upon what evidence are these conclusions based? Where's the evidence that he brings forward to prove his case? There is no evidence. His evidence is based on his presuppositions, which is this. Miracles don't happen. Supernatural things don't happen. Therefore, the resurrection couldn't have happened, and it is impossible. That's what he's basing it upon. Now, what I want us to consider today is, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we know his body was missing. Pagan literature said that. Roman literature said that. Christian literature said that. If he didn't rise from the dead, what happened to him? And why don't people believe in the resurrection? Now, let me start with maybe the first and the most obvious one here. The first issue you're going to have to deal with when you're talking about the resurrection. And that is, some people will not believe because they just don't believe miracles happen. Right? Some people will say it's not scientific, it's not logical, it's not reasonable, miracles don't happen, people don't walk on the water, virgins don't have babies, people are not raised from the dead. Therefore, I do not believe in the resurrection because I have this presupposition, a naturalistic presupposition that says I don't believe in things like that. Now, obviously, if a person says, I can't believe in the resurrection because I don't believe in miracles, well, then you got a problem. Obviously, you're probably going to be at loggerheads because you got two different worldviews when you're coming forward. But I want to look at it and ask a question try to answer that in a couple of ways. The first of all is, how many people really don't believe in miracles? I mean, even people who say they don't believe in miracles, you'll hear them say from time to time, it's a miracle that such and such happened. It's a miracle they weren't killed in that car wreck. It's a miracle. And even though they would say they don't believe in the supernatural, they'll make statements like that. There's something else that's interesting. A recent survey, 2011, in America, said 92% of Americans said they believed in God. Okay? 92%. Now, I confess that their view of God and our view of God could be very different. I confess that. But all I'm saying is, if 92% of Americans believe in God, if they do believe God exists, who are we to limit his powers? I mean, if God does really exist out there, it's only natural he'd have powers that we don't have, right? And he'd have majesty that we don't have, no matter how you view God to be. Powers that are beyond the ability of science to explain. In fact, it's interesting when you talk about science. Many, many scientists, large numbers in the scientific community, will confess and recognize that science is descriptive, not prescriptive. Now, what I mean by that is, science tries to explain what happens. But they can't explain what might be discovered out there in the future, or what they might discover that right now is beyond their ability to understand. So I'm not sure saying, well, I just don't believe in miracles is a good excuse. But let's leave that aside for a minute. Let's go back to the facts here and ask ourselves, what is the best explanation for the empty tomb? Now, let me review for just a minute. Let's not talk about presuppositions. Let's talk about fairy tales. Let's talk about the facts for a minute, and then look at the different theories as they compete with one another and says which one makes the most sense when you look at the facts. Now, let me review the evidence about the tomb. Okay. Number one, the tomb was empty. No doubt about that. No question about that. Jewish literature says that. Roman literature says that. Christian literature says that. No doubt the tomb was empty. They could never got away with this story if the tomb wasn't empty. The earliest Jewish and pagan writers confirm the tomb was empty. Historical evidence shows the tomb was empty. I mean, for example, we said Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. There's never been any other competing arguments. Nobody's ever argued with that fact. He was a known figure. To make that story up wouldn't have made any sense. He was a person who was a part of the party that had Jesus convicted and killed. He was a man who was a rich man who had a private tomb, and they would have known where it was. The story also says women were the first ones to discover the empty tomb. Last week I talked about nobody would have made up a story like that. Because in the first century culture, women's word meant nothing. They weren't even allowed to testify in court. It wouldn't have made any sense to make up a story like that. The Christians would have been insane to create a story like that. But if Christ did not rise from the dead, what did happen? What I'm going to do for the next few minutes, I want to go through some competing theories. These are theories down through history, even to today, that people have used to try to explain the empty tomb without having a resurrection. And you tell me which of these theories, including the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, makes the most